In a previous video, we cut a hole in a drywall ceiling to access a dryer vent. In this video, I will show you how to patch that hole. I have a floor joist right here. So I'm going to cut out about half of the width of the floor joist so that I can put some screws through the new drywall into it. So I'm going to start out by just doing a nice straight score. The good thing about drywall, if you score it the first time correctly, all the other times after it, the blade will kind of follow. Look at it right here. You can actually see a nail where they nailed to the floor joist there already. So all we're going to do is just take that nail and just sink it back up in there. There's a couple of them right there. The other important thing to realize is because we just cut the support that's holding this up, we also want to put in a couple of extra screws or nails up in there to that to hold it tight as well, because we just took away its support. I measured the hole. So that's the sheet I'm going to cut. First thing that I always cut is going to be the short side, because I'll try to cut through that. And if you use a square as a straight edge, you can just put it right up against it, keep it tight, and actually just score right up against it. All I'm doing is just cutting right through the paper on the backside. I'm not actually trying to cut anything else on that backside. Just line it up. First, do a nice straight score. The reason I cut this short section first is now you bend it over, and you just take it right along the backside there, cut the paper. A little bit of extra prep time on this board, you know, making sure there's nothing that's going to keep it from going flush. Just a little bit more time here makes for a much better patch and final product. See, now it fits up in there just how it should. That's beautiful. One thing that's helpful is to just line it up and say that, and that are my boards, and I know I've got about that long on one side. So that way once you go to put it up there, you're not guessing where you're sending your screws. Always make sure to countersink your screw head just a tiny bit, but not too much. Once you pass through the paper, you've lost all your strength. You don't want it to be sticking out, but you want it to be just in there. So on this one, because it's a small one, I would have no qualms only putting those 4 screws, because it's a real small patch. You can put another one here just to kind of in the middle make sure you got something in there, and then the other spot we need to worry about is this guy, just to make sure you just kind of sink it in there so we can guarantee this isn't going to start to bow over time. So this is a regular all-purpose joint compound that it's pre-mixed mud. Even though it's already pre-made and the water content is usually pretty good for what you're doing with a patch, I like to mix it around, get anything that's started to settle mixed in real well, make sure it's nice and smooth. Work from the center out. So I put it on and work out. So what that does is it helps to grab it and move it into that hole. I always keep my pan underneath where I'm working so that if anything falls out, I try to catch it. All you're doing is trying to just fill these spaces. You always get dirty. I mean, come on, look at me, I'm freaking filthy. Now I'm using a 6-inch knife right now. Depending on the size of what you're working with, will determine kind of how big of a knife you want to use. And also you've got a big knife that spans across from wall to out here, and you start dragging it across, it starts getting bumpy with the texture that's already there. You see that? So sometimes a bigger knife isn't always better. You got to do it in sections and try to smooth it as best you can in sections across. Debris, I want to get that out of there, because if I were to start to drag that in my last part and I want it to be real smooth, all those little particles will drag lines in it. So you can see this spot right here where it looks like it's bubbling. That's where there was a gap between the old stuff and the new piece that we put in. So that's why you try to make those gaps as small as possible. That will, as it dries, shrink up, and it might actually, if it's big enough, it'll shrink up and crack. So you want to try to avoid having any type of holes in there if you can avoid it. So now that I've got it pretty well in there, I can use a bigger knife. I'm not trying to drag it this way. I'm going to take it, what I'm trying to do is just float this section, a bigger section, make sure it's nice and smooth. Another big section, nice and smooth. Not pushing real hard, just getting it to where it'll smooth that out. Now, a lot of people say, well, it's your first coat, you don't need to really, you know, it's what we call the ugly coat. Well, that's true, but if your first coat can be close to smooth perfect, or you don't have a whole lot to sand down, it's less you got to sand down and less coats you got to apply again. So sometimes you can get away with one ugly coat being real nice and pretty, and then you do your final coat after you've sanded off any imperfections. So that right there is as good as I'm going to get for a first ugly coat. If I have, see out here, where I know that the line I cut is back here, so all this extra texture picked up this, I can take a wet sponge and actually just, once it starts to dry more, a wet sponge, and I can just sponge that off. And you'll see the new texture, the old texture underneath it start to appear, and that way you don't have, because see all this right here, that's a lot of extra sanding if I was trying to take that off. All right, good. Now we'll clean up our tools, because you get this stuff dried up on there. Yeah, you can get it off, but clean everything up, keep your tools clean, they last longer. They're there for the next job. If you notice, I've changed. It's been a little while while we let it dry. It's another day. So you can use 5-minute mud, which dries really quick, but I didn't care to, so I'm gonna let it dry overnight, come back to it another day. Then we're gonna sand it. So all I'm gonna do is try to sand this area here. I'm gonna get dirty. We're all gonna get pretty dirty doing this, but I'm just using a regular sanding sponge. It's kind of spongy, so gives you a little bit of flexibility, got different angles to it. This here is a sponge that I'm going to be using. It's slightly damp on the back side, has a little bit of surface for sanding, so we'll try that to help where the texture is already behind it. We're going to try to remove some of this buildup. My mistake, I let it dry too much. Takes more work. When it's slightly damp, it comes off real easy. Okay, why do I care about removing all of that extra drywall that we put on there where you've got this old texture? The reason is, if I didn't and it came out to here, once I started to add everything in and try to texture over it, you'd actually see a bump here. So it would outline exactly where you'd cut out. So we try to remove it to make it as flush as possible to what was existing, so that then when you're spraying it, some of this old texture shines through and it helps to blend the texture a little better. So we've got a little spot right there we want to hit because there's not enough mud there, and then this little spot here. So there's not a lot that we have to do. Just fill that guy a tiny bit. Now while that's still damp, we're just gonna go over the spots that we already cleaned up here, because there's no sense leaving that a mess and having to scrub it off again. And then we'll let the rest of it dry and cure. When it's done, we'll give it a final smoothing with a quick once over with our sander. should be good to go so that we can start doing some texture. It's dry, time to sand. Look at that, that's all it takes. Next we will be using wall texture spray in a can. This is orange peel because my walls are orange peel. It's really cool. It's got an adjustable spray nozzle so you can adjust it to have different size texture depending on what you're trying to match. First, you always want to do a test spray just to see if your texture size matches what's already on there. So I set up plastic and it's good backstop, so it's on the wall. I just usually spray it just to see what it'll look like. As you can tell, this was not us, but because we got the texture out, we're gonna hit it anyways. I feel like I got a faulty can. It's spraying all over itself rather than where it should be. The other trick is to try to blend it out. It's kind of a feathering, so you pull it out farther away from where you're just going as well. Helps match the texture farther out. Now we let it dry. This can was not very good. I've had a lot of other cans that have a lot better pressure and spray, but usually it's not just falling out on the can like this, it actually sprays out and hits it. I'm not too happy with this can actually, but I've had other cans in the past that work just fine. So you can actually reuse them by taking this all apart, and if you clean everything out really well, then you can actually save what's left in the can to reuse it on other projects, because usually, like, we didn't use the whole can, or if you have to wipe it down a little bit and then spray more texture to try to get it to match better, you can actually clean this out really well and reuse them. Oh, this is okay because it just kind of naturally blends, but I don't want that sharp tape line on it. This is also why my core used to be in better shape. Useful trick to help your brushes so that it's easier to clean up is just get them very slightly damp before you touch the paint so that they don't dry to the bristles. Makes it easier for cleanup.